Hi guys, welcome to my channel. Thanks for checking out my video. So continuing with some more musical examples and how we can apply some of those scales we've looked at. I'm going to go through some more simple Guitar Hero licks today, this time in the style of Chuck Berry. So Chuck Berry is definitely one of my biggest influences. One of my earliest musical memories is of Back to the Future and Marty McFly rocking out on stage with Johnny B. Good. Oh my god, how good is that movie? Now, everybody obviously knows Johnny B. Good, but Chuck Berry pumped out absolutely hundreds of tracks over his career. In my opinion, he is probably, at least lyrically, one of the greatest songwriters of our time. His effective, almost story-like way of writing songs almost paved the way for artists like Bob Dylan or the Beatles, who cite him as a major influence on their own music. Berry also used the time-honoured African American church and blues music approach, call and response, in exchanging vocal lines with his guitar. The songs School Days or Carol are perfect examples of this. And he was also really the first master of the guitar riff as a hook, inventing repeating rhythmic figures like the opener for many of his songs. So many of Chuck's tracks stick to a simple 12 bar format, and a lot of his lead playing uses a lot of the same tricks throughout. And I think due to this, he is often very underrated in the guitar world. But really, when you start to break down some of Chuck's playing, what he is doing is really not as simple as it may seem. His lead playing is melodic, energetic, exciting, and probably more than anything else, it really fits with the style. So Chuck's sound is also incredibly original. Although his playing style was obviously adapted from his own influences, like T-Bone Walker or Louis Jordan, there is not really anyone else who sounds just like Chuck Berry. Play a few of these licks at your local jam or show, and I'm sure people will instantly get visions of 1950s rock and roll. Anyway, if you haven't listened to Chuck Berry before, oh my god, where have you been? I would definitely recommend him. Mostly for rock and roll style, but his playing will also help you with blues and even some jazz. The best starting point, I would probably say, is his first three albums, his After School Session, A Dozen Berries, or Chuck Berry is on Top. All three of those are absolute masterpieces. They will give you a whole host of classic Berry numbers. Brown Eyed Handsome Man, School Days, Sweet Little 16, Reelin' and Rockin', Roll Over Beethoven, and yes, Johnny B. Good as well. If you don't want to download or buy three albums, if anyone actually buys albums anymore, there are many greatest hit collections out there, and any one of those should give you all the classic tracks. Chuck rose to fame throughout the late 50s with the help of Leonard Chess Records, who were recording a large portion of the blues greats of the time. People like Muddy Waters, Little Walter, Etta James, etc., etc. And Chuck's really one of the key artists in the development of rock and roll. I would definitely argue that if Chuck Berry never played guitar, rock and roll would most certainly be very different. and Marty McFly would be playing something else up there in Back to the Future. So how can we sound like Chuck? Well, guitarists in the 50s really didn't have anywhere near the same options we do today. So getting a usable Chuck Berry sound is probably not too difficult. Chuck also didn't take a huge amount of gear around with him when he toured. And a lot of time when he toured internationally, he wouldn't even take a band, just himself and his guitar, preferring to make the whole process as economical or cost effective as he could, using local pickup bands rather than the cost of flights and shipping for 4 to 5 members and all the gear. So what do we actually need? Well, first off, we need a vintage style tube amp, and we want to turn it up. The only amps available in those days would have been Fender tube amps or similar sort of things. And as we know, Chuck wasn't too fussy with what he played. So as long as you have something along those lines, you should really be good. Pedals, well, really none. As far as I'm aware, I don't even think there were any pedals when Chuck first really got going. Most likely he was just going straight into his amplifier and may have simply rolled his volume back slightly whilst playing rhythm parts and then pushed it up full for solos. If you want, you could use a clean booster just to make your solo stand out a little in songs, if you don't want to mess around with the volume knob. Some sort of vintage style overdrive pedal set really low may also work. I use an Electro Harmonix overdrive pedal, generally set really low, which I find provides a great boost, a little extra dirt, and just a bit more bite. But sometimes you really have to be careful, as Chuck's sound is built more from the full natural sound of a cranked amp, and there isn't a lot of overdrive or distortion in his solos. So what guitar do we need? Well, a lot of the classic Chuck Berry sound is obviously from his one actual piece of touring equipment, which is his Gibson 335. However, the 335 was not actually issued until 1958, and a lot of Chuck's earlier recordings were done before that. And on those, I think he was using an ES 350 thin line or 350T. Anyway, all things aside, the sound really comes from either a hollow or semi-hollow body and with a pair of humbuckers. P90s might get you pretty close as well. Now, these are obviously usually pretty expensive, especially if you're looking at Gibson models or even high-end Gretsch models. But there are a lot of alternatives that will get you there. Epiphone makes some really good cheaper models, and Gretsch also have a lower budget range that are really raved about. For me, however, I'm not one of the biggest guys, and personally, I find these guitars at times a little bit awkward to play. I think I've made these licks using a bit of a hybrid guitar of mine called a Cabroneda. If you've watched many of my videos already, you probably knew there was another Fender plug coming. Now, this is essentially a thin line Telecaster model with Gretsch Fidelitron humbuckers. This is the closest sort of thing I have, and this works for me. Maybe the sound doesn't get you completely there. The Gretsch pickups will definitely have more high-end sparkle than your traditional humbucker. But like I said, this works for me. The other thing I use sometimes is I have a vintage reissue 50s telly. And I find that although it's solid body, that gets me really quite close as well. That has some custom vintage pickups and actually has a four-way switch on it as well. So I can put both pickups into series, which is almost like having a humbucker. For me, a Stratocaster or a normal Les Paul just doesn't really seem to get there. With the Strat, the sound sounds a bit too polished, just not really raw enough. And the Les Paul, I think, just pushes a little bit too much. But that's just my opinion. And obviously those things can be changed with amp settings and pedals. There are no real rules to music. Another way to boost your chuck tone could be to try changing up your strings. Chuck Berry apparently used very light strings, possibly 8, and some even say banjo strings. Other things I have read say flat wounds, which are usually primarily for jazz, and may have been the case with his earlier recordings. So anyway, what is Chuck actually doing musically? Well, although Chuck's playing can be quite fast at times, almost to the point that it sometimes sounds that it's tripping over itself. When we break it down, we can see or we can hear that most of the time he really is just sticking to both the major and the minor blues scales and mixing them both together. But usually with a bit more of a focus on the major side. There's a lot of chromaticism in Chuck's licks, so climbing up or down one semitone at a time. There's a lot of bends, tweaks, releases, and a lot of double stops, which is playing two notes at the same time, as well as many chord-based licks. Anyway, as I said before, Chuck's playing, I think, at times goes very underrated. But when you really start trying to learn some of these licks and keep up with the fast tempo of rock and roll, you may find that they are a lot harder than you might have imagined. Anyway, that's probably enough info. I've tried to put a few simple licks together here in this video with the tabs. Hopefully you can learn these and start putting them into your own playing, or use them as a starting point to create your own. Alright, let's check them out.